Sir, do you know this melody?
Yes, I think I do.
The winter evening pressed itself against the tall glass of the Rhodes Tower lobby, turning every pane into a trembling mirror of rain and distant city lights. People hurried through the revolving doors with umbrellas dripping and tempers short, their footsteps sharp against the marble floor. No one noticed the young blind girl sitting at the polished black piano in the corner, her hands hovering like doves unsure of where to land. Ilara Wynne took a long, steady breath before letting her fingers touch the keys, and the first notes rose like the faint glow of a lantern in fog. The sound was soft, trembling, almost hesitant, yet it carried a strange familiarity, like a memory half remembered or a lullaby heard once and never forgotten. Selim Rhodes stepped out of the elevator with the storm still on his shoulders, his phone pressed to his ear as he tried to steady a failing deal and a fraying patience. His assistant trailed behind him, whispering reminders he no longer had space for. His days had become an endless hallway of meetings and decisions, all of them loud, none of them meaningful. But when that melody drifted across the lobby, thin, fragile, but heartbreakingly certain, he stopped walking mid-sentence. He didn't even notice the elevator doors closing behind him. His voice faltered. The melody curled around him, tightening like a hand around his heart. On the other end of the call, someone asked if he was still there, but he couldn't answer. The sound came from the corner where the piano stood, lit only by a single warm lamp and the passing headlights from the street outside. Ilara was leaning slightly forward, her face angled toward the keys, her sightless eyes half closed as though she were listening to the colors hidden in each note. Selim felt a chill crawl beneath his ribs. Not from the cold. From recognition. He hadn't heard that melody in years, yet it lived somewhere deep in his bones. Morel, his late wife, used to hum it while brushing their son's hair, or when she walked barefoot across their old kitchen in the early mornings. He could still remember the exact way her lips curved at the final note, soft and sure. The song had been hers, private, intimate, never written down, hardly ever shared. And yet here it was, alive again, in the hands of a stranger who could not even see the world she was pouring her soul into. His assistant tugged at his sleeve, trying to anchor him back to the world of contracts and urgency, but Selim gently pulled away. The lobby blurred around him. Only the piano remained sharp, like a spotlight cutting through fog. Ilara's fingers stumbled briefly, then regrouped, and she exhaled as though steadying herself. Selim took an involuntary step closer. Something about the way she played, the careful touch, the searching pauses, felt like she was calling out for someone she couldn't name. He found himself walking toward her, each footstep drawn by something he couldn't rationalize. Her melody slowed, trembled, and then she lifted her hands slightly off the keys as though listening for an answer only the air could give. Without turning her head, she spoke softly. "Sir, do you know this melody?" Her voice was delicate, made for small spaces and gentle truths. Selim felt the words strike through him with almost physical force. For a moment he couldn't speak because naming the recognition felt too raw, too intimate, too painful. "Yes," he whispered before he could stop himself. Ilara's smile grew with quiet relief. "I hope someone might," she said. "It feels like home somehow. Like something kind." Her fingers brushed the keys again, tentative. Selim lowered himself onto the bench beside her without meaning to. He did not introduce himself, did not give explanations. He simply watched her hands, slender and pale under the warm lamp, as they explored the opening notes again. Her sightless eyes didn't settle anywhere. They simply softened as though imagining a sky only she could see. "Where did you learn it?" he asked, his voice low, almost afraid of the answer. "My mother used to play it," she murmured. "Before my sight faded. Before she paused, her throat tightening. Before she left." The rain outside strengthened, tapping against the glass like fingertips seeking entry. Selim swallowed, feeling the sharp echo of his own loss move inside him. Morel had vanished from his life with no warning, no chance to prepare, no time for goodbye. Her heart had simply stopped one morning, leaving Selim with a child who was too young to understand and a grief too heavy to carry. "I've never heard anyone else play it," he said. "Not since." She turned her face toward his voice. "Not since someone you loved?" His silence answered for him. Ilara nodded with a tenderness that surprised him. She wasn't prying, wasn't pitying. She simply understood in that quiet way people who have suffered recognize another wounded soul. Her fingers pressed one soft chord, fragile as breath. "Music remembers for us," she said. Before Selim could respond, his assistant rushed across the lobby, breathless and alarmed. "Sir, they're waiting for you upstairs. We really can't postpone another meeting." The moment broke. Ilara gently withdrew her hands from the keys. Selim felt the cold rush back in. "I'm sorry," he said, standing reluctantly. "Don't be," she replied with a small warm smile. "You heard it? That's enough." But her words only deepened the ache in him. He followed his assistant back toward the elevators, though every step felt wrong. When the doors closed, he caught one last glimpse of her sitting alone under the warm lamp, her hands resting quietly on the silent keys. The melody still echoed in his mind, strong and clear, refusing to fade the way memories usually did. By the time he reached the conference room on the 21st floor, the city lights had dimmed beneath thicker clouds. His team spoke in numbers and projections, their voices flat, but Selim heard none of it. His mind kept drifting back to the girl at the piano, the melody she played, the ghost it woke inside him. Halfway through a presentation, he excused himself abruptly. He stepped into the hallway, leaning against the glass wall that overlooked the rain-soaked city. His breath fogged the window. His heartbeat felt uneven. That song. How could she have known it? How could she play it with the exact softness Morel once did? His phone buzzed. A text from his young son's school, an automated reminder about tomorrow's winter recital. Arlo's small voice echoed in Selim's memory. "Will you come this time, Dad?" He had promised, again. And he feared breaking that promise, again. The rain outside thinned into a mist as though listening. Selim looked down toward the lobby far below, where warm lights still glowed around the piano. He felt something shifting inside him, slow but undeniable. The melody had not followed him upstairs. It had led him there. And he knew, with a certainty that tightened in his chest, that the girl who played it held a key to a truth he had not dared to face since the day he lost his wife. As a cold draft whispered along the hallway, Selim closed his eyes and realized something unsettling. The melody Ilara played wasn't just familiar. It wasn't just Morel's lullaby. It was the final tune Morel played the night before she died, one she had never shared with anyone else. And that meant Ilara couldn't have learned it by accident. The next morning unfolded in a muted palette of gray clouds and thin winter light. The kind that softened edges and made the world feel half asleep. Selim sat at the breakfast table with a cup of untouched coffee while Arlo swung his small legs under the chair, humming to himself as he worked on a paper snowflake. The boy didn't know about the melody that had shaken his father the night before, but he sensed something subtle in the air, an unease, a quiet shifting. Children always noticed emotional weather before adults admitted it existed. Selim tried to appear present, yet his mind kept drifting to the piano in the lobby, the blind girl whose fingers carried a song he thought belonged solely to the ghosts of his past. Every pause she played still vibrated along the walls of his ribs. When Arlo lifted his head and asked softly if his father would come to the recital tonight, Selim felt the familiar pinch of guilt. He nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly, as though speed could make a promise more believable. Arlo's shy, hopeful smile lit the room, and Selim felt something warm and painful at the same time, as though hope itself could bruise. At work, hours passed in indistinct meetings, but Selim heard none of it. The entire day bent toward one thought. He needed to see her again, needed to understand how she knew that melody. The questions pressed against him with the weight of unsaid years. When evening finally came, he stepped out of the elevator with a strange, unsteady anticipation. The lobby was quiet, the trailing hush of a long workday lingering in the air. The piano lamp glowed like a faint ember, and beneath it sat Ilara, her hands resting delicately on her lap as though she had been waiting for something she couldn't name. Selim approached slowly, feeling each step as if it were a choice he had delayed too long. "You came back," she said without turning her head. Her hearing, sharp and intuitive, caught the exact moment his shadow blended with the warm light around her. Selim sat beside her, careful not to disturb the fragile stillness between them. "I needed to hear you play again," he admitted. She smiled, faint but genuine. Most people pass by without listening. Selim swallowed, wondering how many melodies she had offered to a world too hurried to care. "I didn't just listen," he said. "I remembered." Ilara brushed her fingertips over the keys but didn't play. "The song belongs to someone in your heart," she said quietly, sensing the tremor behind his words. He didn't answer, he didn't need to. The silence between them carried truth more gently than explanation ever could. Before he could speak again, footsteps echoed near the entrance. Arlo appeared, carrying his winter coat in his arms, followed closely by the driver who had escorted him. The boy's eyes landed on the piano, then on Ilara, and something curious lit his face. He approached shyly as though fearing he might interrupt something delicate. Ilara straightened as soon as she sensed his nearness. Is someone small standing in front of me? She asked with a playful softness. Arlo nodded, then remembered she couldn't see it and whispered a quiet yes. Would you like to hear her play? Selim asked, but the boy's eyes were already shining with anticipation. Ilara invited him closer with a gentle gesture. Arlo reached her hand with both of his small palms, guiding her fingers to the keys as though placing a treasure in her keeping. She laughed softly, an airy, surprised sound that loosened something tight in Selim's chest. Which song do you want? She asked. Arlo hesitated, then spoke with that fragile bravery children use when mentioning someone they miss. The one Mom used to hum. Selim felt his breath stop. Ilara's hands froze for a moment, sensing the sudden shift in the air, the ache beneath the child's voice. Her fingers lowered again with reverence. And then she played. The melody landed differently this time, not as a haunting memory, but as a gentle extension of Arlo's longing. The notes floated softly, like snowflakes unsure where to fall, touching the room with a warmth that felt impossible for Winter to hold. Arlo closed his eyes, leaning slightly toward the sound as though it were a safe door opening. Selim watched them, the blind girl and his fragile-hearted boy, and something inside him broke open like thawing ice. He realized how much silence his grief had built around Arlo, how often he'd filled the void with work instead of arms. The melody didn't wound him this time, it humbled him. As the final note lingered, Arlo whispered, "How do you know Mom's song?" Ilara's expression softened with a sadness that wasn't only her own. "Because someone I loved played it too," she murmured. "Maybe songs find people who need each other." The driver cleared his throat politely, reminding Selim that time was slipping. They had to leave for the school recital. Arlo tugged at Selim's sleeve, but before they left, he reached out impulsively and hugged Ilara's arm with small, grateful hands. She held still, surprised, her lips forming a soft breath of wonder. When Arlo stepped back, she lifted her face toward Selim. "He has a gentle spirit," she said. Selim nodded. "He lost that for a while," he admitted. Tonight, he found a piece of it again. After they left, Selim couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible had shifted, like a door silently unlocking inside two broken homes. At the recital, he watched Arlo sing off-key, smile shyly, and glance toward the empty front row seat that once belonged to Morel. For the first time in years, Selim didn't feel paralyzed by the void beside him. Instead, he felt an unfamiliar longing to return to the piano room where a blind girl played a melody that refused to let him stay unchanged. When he returned to the building later that night, hoping to find her again, he stepped into a lobby swallowed by deep quiet. The lamp was off. The piano bench was empty. Yet the faint warmth of her presence lingered in the air, like the last ember of a dying fire. He approached the instrument, touching the wooden edge the way someone touches the last remnant of a dream. His hand brushed against something thin tucked between the keys. It was a small folded paper. In delicate handwriting barely raised enough for his fingertips to feel, one sentence waited for him. "I didn't learn the melody, I remembered it." Snow fluttered sideways across the city that night, carried by a wind that felt older than the buildings it slipped between. Selim stepped out of the revolving doors with the folded note still clutched in his hand, its message echoing louder than the storm around him. "I didn't learn the melody, I remembered it." Those words struck something deep, something fragile. Memories could be inherited through heartache, through longing, through strange threads life wove between strangers. But this felt different. The note trembled with meaning he couldn't unravel alone. And he knew, with an ache that tugged between guilt and need, that he had to find her. He searched the lobby the next day and the day after that, lingering near the piano with the clumsy impatience of someone unused to vulnerability. People moved around him in a blur of routine and purpose, while he remained fixed in place, staring at the silent instrument as though the keys might speak. When Ilara finally returned on the third evening, walking cautiously through the echoing lobby with her cane tapping a soft rhythm, Selim felt relief unfurl in his chest like warmth, spilling into a cold room. She paused, sensing the shift in air that said someone was waiting. "You came back," she murmured, though the words carried a faint tremble. Selim stepped closer. "I found your note," he said. Ilara tilted her head slightly toward his voice, the corners of her lips tightening in a mix of anticipation and fear. "I thought you would." He unfolded the paper gently, as though the creases might hold an answer he'd missed. "What did you mean?" he asked. "How can you remember something that wasn't taught to you?" Ilara walked toward the piano bench with slow, careful steps, her fingers grazing the wooden edge as if greeting an old friend. She sat, her breath steadying as she placed both hands on the keys without pressing down. "There's remembering," she whispered, "and there's not forgetting." Selim took a seat beside her, their shoulders separated by only a few inches yet filled with unspoken weight. She exhaled shakily. "When I lost my sight at 12, I didn't lose everything at once. Some memories stayed clear. Others turned into shadows. But the melody, it survived." He listened closely, not to her words but to the quiet strain behind them. She brushed her fingertips lightly across the keys, creating a soft ghost of a sound. "My mother, she wasn't the kind of woman who stayed in one place. We moved through towns and shelters like leaves caught in wind. Sometimes we played on street corners for money. Sometimes we slept in bus stations. But no matter where we were, she played that melody at night. Said it was our anchor." Her voice wavered, the emotion folded carefully, too fragile to fully unfold. "The night before I lost my sight, she held me close and played it slowly. I fell asleep to it. When I woke the next morning, she was gone." Selim felt the ache drift through her words like a bruise. "You think she abandoned you?" he asked gently. Alara shook her head. "I think she couldn't bear to watch me lose everything piece by piece. Grief makes people disappear in different ways." Her fingers pressed a single note, soft, yearning. "When I play that song, it feels like I'm reaching for her. Reaching for the last good thing I remember." Selim leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his eyes burning with a mixture of empathy and unease. "My wife played it too," he said, voice thick. "Morel. She used to hum it while holding Arlo. She never said where she learned it. I always thought she made it up." Ilara turned her blind gaze toward him, as though studying the shape of his grief. "Maybe she remembered it too," she murmured. "The same way I did." The possibility hung between them like a breath caught in a cold room. Selim closed his eyes briefly, letting the realization strike. It wasn't just coincidence. Their pasts, their losses, their melodies, threads woven together long before they had ever met. And yet the closeness of that truth frightened him. He straightened, struggling to breathe evenly. "Alara, there's something else," he said. "Something I can't ignore." She stiffened slightly. "Your work noticed me," she whispered before he could speak further. Selim felt the air shift sharply. "What do you mean?" She pulled her hands into her lap. "People took pictures of us talking last night. Someone posted them online. They're saying," she swallowed the words but he could hear them anyway, "scandal, impropriety, motives twisted by strangers who loved noise more than truth." "None of that matters," Selim said firmly. But she shook her head. "It matters to you. To your son. To your company. I don't want to be the reason your life becomes harder." He reached for her hand without thinking, then stopped himself just a breath away. "You aren't a burden," he said. "Your presence hasn't harmed anything." But Alara's expression tightened, her voice barely rising above a whisper. "People like me have learned that our existence can be inconvenient." Her words hit him harder than she meant them to. Selim stood abruptly, pacing a few steps as frustration twisted under his skin. "I don't care about rumors," he said. "What I care about is how you know that song, and why it feels like something more than memory." Alara drew in a shaky breath. "Maybe we're connected by the same loss," she said. "Maybe your wife and my mother crossed paths once, or maybe they shared the song with each other." She hesitated. "But there's something I've never told anyone. Something I'm afraid to tell you." Selim turned, tension tightening his jaw. "Tell me," he urged. Ilara reached for the piano, tracing the keys as though grounding herself. "When I was very young, maybe 3, maybe 4, I remember my mother whispering a name in her sleep. A name she clung to like it saved her." The lobby around them grew impossibly quiet, as though the building itself leaned in. She turned her face toward him slowly, her voice trembling. She whispered it every night for months before she left. Selim's heartbeat thudded through him. "What name?" he asked. Ilara swallowed hard, as though releasing the word might change everything. "Rhodes," she said. She whispered Rhodes. Over and over. Like a memory she missed or a promise she couldn't keep. For a moment Selim forgot how to breathe. The lobby lights flickered faintly, the silence stretching until it nearly fractured. His entire world tilted on its axis. Alara's mother, whispering his surname. His wife humming the same rare melody. The impossible thread binding their pasts tugged tight. Alara heard the shift in his breathing. "Selim," she whispered. "Why does that name frighten you?" He stared at her, realization dawning with a cold, devastating clarity. "Because," he said, voice breaking, "Rhodes wasn't just my surname. It was my wife's maiden name too." And somewhere inside that truth lay a connection that would unravel everything they believed about their separate lives. The wind sharpened as night settled over the city, carrying with it the taste of unfinished truths. Selim's steps echoed down the dim hallway after he left the lobby, each footfall weighted with the revelation that had cracked open the foundation of everything he thought he knew. Ilara's mother whispering Rhodes in her sleep. Morel's maiden name also Rhodes. Two women carrying the same melody, the same ache. Threads woven long before either of them entered his life. But threads had endings and he needed to find where these tangled ones led. He didn't sleep. He barely breathed. At dawn, pale light spilled across the floor of his apartment, washing over the framed photos of Morel holding Arlo, Morel laughing in a sunlit garden, Morel humming the melody that had returned to haunt him through Ilara's trembling fingers. Selim stared at those frozen memories until the walls grew too tight around him. He had to find her. He had to face what had been left in the dark too long. Ilara, meanwhile, was folding her life into a small suitcase in her apartment across the city. She packed slowly, carefully, her hands brushing over each item as though memorizing its shape one last time. She didn't cry, she simply existed with a quiet heaviness, the kind carried by those who have learned not to expect rescue. Her cane leaned against the wall, and in the center of the table sat the folded paper where she'd written her truth, the name that had risen from the shadows of memory. She told herself leaving was the only way to keep him from drowning in a connection that felt too dangerous, too tangled. But her hands were shaking. Because leaving meant losing the one place her melody had been truly heard. A knock startled her. She stiffened, hugging the suitcase to her chest. Selim's voice broke through the door, low, tight with urgency. Ilara, please open the door. She didn't move. His next words cracked. I know everything feels complicated, but don't shut me out. Not now. She swallowed hard, then opened the door. Selim stood there with the exhaustion of a man who had spent the entire night wrestling with ghosts. Snow clung to his coat. His hair was damp from the storm. But his eyes carried a clarity she hadn't seen before. You're leaving, he said softly. Not an accusation, just a truth laid bare. Ilara tightened her grip on the suitcase. I shouldn't stay, she whispered. Your life is already under scrutiny. I don't want to make it worse. Selim stepped in, closing the door behind him with gentle finality. My life has been worse for years, he said. And you didn't cause that. She shook her head. There's too much between us now. Too many questions. Selim's voice lowered, steady and raw. Then let's face the answers together. He took the suitcase from her hands and set it aside. She flinched, overwhelmed by his nearness, by the way he made the world feel less sharp. You said your mother whispered my surname, he continued. And you described places you lived, places Morel lived before she met me. Ilara's breath hitched. I thought I imagined that, she said. But the memories, they never left. Selim moved closer, but not enough to intimidate, just enough to steady her trembling presence. Ilara, he said gently, there's something you need to hear. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small photograph. Its edges were worn, softened by time. This was Morel at 18, he said, placing it in her hands. Ilara traced the image with trembling fingers. Her breath caught. She had the same necklace, she whispered. My mother wore it. The carved rose pendant. Selim's throat tightened. Morel always said it belonged to a sister she lost. A sister who disappeared when they were children. Ilara went still as stone. My mother never spoke about her childhood, she murmured. Only that she ran from something she couldn't bear. Selim exhaled, the truth settling between them like a fragile revelation. Ilara, your mother was Morel's sister. The world tilted for her. She took a step back, hands covering her mouth as though trying to catch all the pieces of herself that suddenly didn't fit anymore. Then the melody, was their mother's, Selim finished. Passed through their childhood. Carried through their heartbreaks. That's why you remembered it. It wasn't just yours. It was your family's. Silence held them in a delicate balance. Outside, snow began to fall again, quiet flakes drifting like soft echoes of the truth they'd uncovered. Ilara steadied herself on the back of a chair. I'm related to your wife, she whispered, the words fragile but steady. That makes Arlo, her voice broke, unable to finish. Selim stepped closer, placing a hand near hers on the chair, not touching but offering steadiness. He's your cousin, he said softly. And you are the last piece of Morel's past I never knew. Ilara's knees wobbled and she lowered herself carefully to sit. Tears she hadn't allowed for years slipped down her cheeks. All this time, she whispered, I thought I was alone. Selim kneeled in front of her, his voice low, tender. You were never alone. You just needed someone who remembered the same song. She laughed through a sob, soft, disbelieving. That melody carried us both, she said. It brought us here. Selim nodded. It brought us home. They sat in silence for a moment, breathing in the fragile miracle of connection rediscovered. Then Selim stood and extended his arm. Come with me, he said. Not a command, an invitation. Ilara hesitated, but something inside her unfolded like dawn breaking behind closed eyes. She reached for his arm, fingers brushing the fabric of his coat, and let him guide her out into the softly falling snow. They returned to the Rhodes Tower together, the storm easing as though the city itself were holding its breath. When they stepped into the lobby, the piano lamp flickered to life automatically, casting its warm glow across the marble floor. Selim guided her to the bench. Play it again, he whispered. Let the building hear what it was always meant to hear. Ilara sat, her fingers resting on the keys with newfound courage. The first note trembled, but the second found strength. The melody rose from her hands, not as a plea, not as a memory, but as a reclamation of everything she'd lost and everything she'd found. Selim stood beside her, feeling the sound wrap around him like a blessing. Arlo arrived moments later, rubbing sleep from his eyes, drawn by the music that had shaped his childhood. When he saw Ilara, he climbed onto the bench beside her without hesitation. She smiled, tears slipping freely now, and shifted her hands so he could play a few simple notes with her. The lobby filled with a warmth that defied the cold outside, a harmony stitched from lineage, loss, and newfound belonging. As the final chord faded, Ilara turned her face toward Selim. What happens now? She whispered. Selim looked at her, his expression steady with the kind of certainty that only truth can build. Now, he said quietly, we rebuild the home our past tried to take from us. But before she could absorb the weight of his words, a sudden gust of wind pushed through the revolving doors, scattering a handful of snowflakes across the piano keys. One landed on the folded photograph on the bench, Morel's face dusted in white. And in that moment, framed by winter's breath, Ilara whispered something that made Selim's heart stutter. I hear another melody, she said softly. One I haven't played yet.